You can start now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته Inshallah, today we'll be continuing with the series of Islamic jurisprudence, and today will be the third lecture, which will be dealing with the formation of the legal schools of thought. I'll be talking about six madhahib. Five of them are Sunni madhab, and the sixth one is Fiqh Jafriya, since it is only an academic discussion. I don't want to take any sides and I don't want to start any controversies. It's just for academic understanding of how these madhhabs were formed and have evolved over a period of time. This will be the last lecture in this series before the month of Ramadan, and inshallah will continue after the month of Ramadan. The resources that I have utilized in creating these talks are basically four books. First is a book called Islam by Dr. Fazlur Rahman. Second is Islamic Law by Dr. Mawil Izzuddin. The third is The Evolution of Fiqh, written by Abu Amina Bilal Phillips. The next one is Understanding Islamic Law by Hisham M. Ramadan. And I've also benefited from a small book in Urdu, Tarikh Fiqh wal Fuqaha, The History of Fiqh and Fuqaha by Mufti Hamad Allah. So I'll be quoting these scholars as well. But if you want detailed information, then these are present in the books that I have mentioned. So Dr. Fazlur Rahman outlines the reason behind the formation of the distinct Islamic madhab. So he mentioned that the freedom of legal thought in early Islam during the first and second centuries led to the accumulation of many legal opinions in different Islamic centers in Iraq, the Hijaz, Syria, and Egypt. Now, these were the main centers of Islamic learning. Each center had many, many companions of the Prophet ﷺ. These companions had carried the hadith and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. They had their students as well. They were in correspondence with each other. They would meet with each other during the time of Hajj. They will exchange ideas. We also know that Imam Malik had written a letter to Imam Abu Layth, as well explaining his methodology of referring the ta'amul of the people of the Ahlul Medina, the people of Medina. So we know that people were aware of what was going on in the other Islamic centers, but they were not fighting. There was no rift. There's a difference between ikhtilaf and khilaf. Ikhtilaf is a difference of opinion. And there is a saying, ikhtilaf ummati rahma, which according to some scholars, including Imam Malik, is a hadith, that the difference of opinion among the scholars of my ummah is a blessing. Whereas khilaf is where people stand up against each other and start to fight. So although there was ikhtilaf of opinion, difference of opinion among the scholars, they respected each other because they knew that these opinions were derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. The difference of opinion was basically because of the different interpretation of the Holy Quran in the light of the local customary law and different application of the strategies of qiyas, which is analogical reasoning, and rai, which is a reasoned opinion. Now, in due course of time, these legal opinions began to be centered around an eminent legal personality. It doesn't necessarily imply that the mazahib we are talking about started from these personalities. These madahib or these legal opinions were already in circulation, they were already in development from the time of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain, but they started to become crystallized and included in the body of one particular school of thought and centered around an eminent legal personality of that time whose name they subsequently carried. So there were multiple schools of thought. The singular is madhab, the plural is madhab. Now, what actually is a madhab? Linguistically, it is derived from the root dhahaba. Dhahaba means to go, to take a path. So linguistically, it means a way of going, a path. In due course of time, it became the collective path of a group or a legal school of thought. So this is the istilahi or the terminology. The spread of Islam into new lands resulted in confronting new cultures and customs that were not directly addressed by the Holy Quran and the Sunnah. But we have to remember that Quran and Sunnah did not abrogate anything that was cultural or traditional unless it was contrary to the spirit of our Sharia. There was, however, a need for forming collective opinion. So at the beginning of the second century after Hijrah, almost all the companions Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain had passed away. Now, when the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain were alive, people could easily go to them and ask and hear a hadith directly from them or get their fatwa, their opinion. But now they were no more. It was around that time that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz wrote letters to the governors of several Islamic centers in his Khilafat, in his kingdom, asking them to collect whatever they had preserved from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and from the opinions of the Sahaba. And it is at that time that the process of collecting and writing down the hadith and the legal opinions of the Sahaba actually started. Although there were collections of hadith, individual collections by different Sahaba that were already in circulation. Inshallah, I'll give a talk about the collection of hadith, and we will know that hadith was written even during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, more than 200 years before Imam Bukhari. The principles for validating the derivation of law from revelation were needed because, as I mentioned, Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajmain were no more. They were the authority after the Prophet ﷺ. Now they were scholars, and many of them were the students of the Sahaba. And then during that period of time when the madhab were established, they were students of the students of the Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajmain. However, there were too many different reports, too many different opinions, and legal verdicts circulating as new problems and questions constantly arose. Like people would go to the leading scholar of their time and ask a question that was not addressed by the earlier scholars. So people were giving opinions based upon their best ijtihad, but it was a time now that those opinions needed to be discussed and a consensus needed to be reached so that it could be collected and recorded for subsequent generations. So this was a continuous process of formation, the development of comprehensive fiqh methodology, and process of extrapolating new legal directives as they were needed was the need of the time. And according to Dr. Fazlur Rahman, it was neither a controlled nor instant occurrence, which means the major jurists were actually free to exercise their ijtihad. And in some cases, they actually revoked their own ijtihad if they found a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Both Imam Ash-Shafi'i and Imam Abu Hanifa have been reported to mention that if you find a Sahih hadith, fahuwa madhabi, then it is my madhab. There developed at least 19 schools of jurisprudential thought over a period of about 300 years. Now, I have read that there were actually many more than that, but this is the number that I can quote from a book. Among these madhab were Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, Zahiri, Jariri, which was the madhab of Imam Ibn Tabari, Abdullah ibn Jarir al-Tabri, Imam Awza'i, Imam Layth, Imam al-Qurtubi, Imam al-Thawri in the Sunni tradition. Interestingly, I will mention it in more detail when we discuss the leading Imams, including Imam al-Shafi'i, that Imam al-Shafi'i studied under Imam Malik in Medina. When Imam Malik passed away, he studied under Imam Hassan al-Shaybani, who was a student of Abu Hanifa, and later on he traveled to learn from Imam Layth. But by the time he reached, he found out that Imam Layth had passed away. And I've heard it from a very reputable Imam in our own community that Imam Shafi'i thought that Imam Layth was actually a bigger scholar than Imam Malik, and Allah knows best. Now, on the Shia side, we have the Fiqh Jafariya, then there were Alawis, Alawites, Bektashis, Ismaili, Zaidi, and Ibadi. Some of them are still in vogue in different parts of the world. The golden era of Islamic jurisprudence started during the Abbasid period from 750 of the current era, and various Islamic sciences were formalized in that period. I'm not saying that they were initiated in that period, they were already going on, but this process of formalizing and writing down Islamic fiqh, as well as collection of ahadith, the authentication of ahadith, the writing of tafasir formally, they all started during that period. 5 major schools of fiqh have survived and have flourished. The others went into extinction or survived within a small locality with very limited number of followers. And these five, four of them are Sunni, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and the Fiqh Jafariya or Jafari in the Shia tradition. The school of Ahlul Hadith has gradually become a madhab in its own right. The Zahiri madhab, initiated by Dawood al-Zahiri, found limited acceptance, but it has also uh, found more widespread acceptance in certain parts of the world, especially under Ibn Hazm and Imam Ash-Shawkani. So now we will take a brief overview of these madahib. I will not be discussing the leading personalities whose name these madahib carry, because inshallah we will be discussing the lives of the great jurists, Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal from a book, The Four Imams, their lives, works, and schools of jurisprudence by Muhammad Abu Zahra. So the Hanafi madhab was established upon the rules of interpretation developed by Imam Abu Hanifa, but he has a strong lineage going back to Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu ta'ala. So its roots go back to Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu ta'ala through his student Qatada, whose student was Ibrahim Nakhai, who was actually a Tabai as well. He learned from some of the Sahaba, including Aisha radiallahu ta'ala, and Nakhai's student Hamad ibn Abu Sulaiman, who was the immediate teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa. The followers of the Hanafi school are found principally in Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Guyana, Trinidad, and to a more limited extent, Egypt. The book that I read does not mention South Africa, America, and the United Kingdom, where the Hanafi madhab are multiplying. What was the Imam Abu Hanifa's procedure? The strongest element of the methodology he taught was the concept of consultation. وَأَمْرُهُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ shura. Their mutual affairs are decided on the basis of mutual consultation. He would present an issue or problem for his students to solve through consultation, discussion, and analysis. Once they reached a consensus on an issue, which could take weeks, the decision was recorded. Now, it is interesting to note that Imam Abu Hanifa had about 40 students in that council. Each one of them was a scholar in his own right. Three of them became very famous. Imam Abu Yusuf was a Qadi, Imam Muhammad Hassan Ash-Shaybani, and Imam Zufar, who actually died at an early age. But based upon some of the books that I have read, that he had a bright mind. In some cases, Imam Abu Hanifa's own opinion was overruled by his students, and the fatwa in the Hanafi madhab on some of those issues is not based upon Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, but the opinion of his students or later day scholars. Now, this is something important that I want you to focus because at the end of this discussion, I will talk about an important issue. So the principles of Hanafi fiqh, like other fiqh as well, are number one, Holy Quran. So Holy Quran is an initial source of Islamic theology. Second is the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. According to Imam Abu Hanifa's principle, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's Sunnah is specific. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam Sunnah in verbal form, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told somebody to do this thing or ordered it, then it supersedes his actions, because the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could be related to him only. If a single hadith, I will not go into the classification of hadith, but just in general, the Sahih ahadith, the authentic ahadith, are classified mainly into three categories: a single hadith or khabar wahid or khabar ahad, a mashhur hadith, and a mutawatir hadith. So here we're talking about if a single hadith coming from one sahabi or a limited number of sahabi, if it contradicts a mutawatir or consecutive hadith, then the ahad hadith will not be put into practice. Ahad hadith will not be applied if it is in conflict with the Holy Quran. A hadith had to be widely known, called mashhur hadith, if it is to be used as a legal proof. And then the consensus or ijma, the scholars' unanimous opinion reached at a certain period after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For Abu Hanifa, the ijma is a Shari'i argument. He gave greater regard to the opinion of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain than his own. He used to say that if there is an opinion even from a single Sahabi, he will go with that opinion. However, when it came to Tabain and subsequent scholars, he said hum rijal wa nahnu rijal. They were also people, we are also people, which means that in that situation, I'm entitled to have an opinion. The principles of Hanafi fiqh continuing. Next is the analogy or qiyas, which means making a religious ruling by way of analogy. However, there are permitted and prohibited types of analogy which falls into the jurisdiction of principles of fiqh or usul al-fiqh, which I will not discuss in this lecture. The prohibited analogy includes making religious ruling if arguments are already provided in the Holy Quran and Sunnah, which means you cannot use qiyas if you have something in the Holy Quran and the Sunnah directly related to the issue under discussion. Next principle is the principle of preference or istihsan. It is applied unless the issue is solved with the help of all above mentioned methods, the four methods that we have mentioned. This approach implies preferring the best argument or one of several available arguments regarding a certain religious matter. The next verse, Imam Abu Hanifa will take into consideration the urf or the local conditions. Unless they contradict Holy Quran and Sunnah, there is a principle of fiqh called al-ada muhakkama, which means the local customs have to be given their due right, or they have to be observed. Obviously, if they contradict the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, you cannot take it. This is mentioned in a hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Man ra'al mu'minuna hasan fahuwa hasan indallah. What the Muslims consider to be good is good in front of Allah. And here he used the plural word muslimuna, the collective opinion of the scholars of that particular area when dealing with that issue. However, these cultural or local traditions are not accepted in case they are in conflict with the Holy Quran and the Sunnah. And this is how customs of a multiplicity of cultures attained legal precedence in the legal system and became classified as Islamic, although they were not directly dealt with in the Holy Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Maliki madhab is named after Imam Malik ibn Anas ibn Amir. He was born in Medina. He was a contemporary of Imam Abu Hanifa. He was younger than Imam Abu Hanifa, and the two are reported to have met as well, and they paid great respect to each other's opinion. Imam Malik gave great importance to the customary practices of the people of Medina, the Amal Alul Medina. His madhab is still followed, and mostly in Algeria, Bahrain, Chad, Upper Egypt, Kuwait, Mali, Morocco, Nigeria, Qatar, and Tunisia. One of our earlier imams here, Imam Salah Sultan, once mentioned that if Imam Malik had students like Imam Abu Hanifa had, the Maliki madhab would be dominant now. What are the principles of Maliki fiqh? The Holy Quran, obviously, Sunnah. A hadith was, however, rejected according to the Maliki methodology if it was contradicted by the customary practice of the Madinans. He is reported to have said, Alfu min alfin khairu min wahid, that if you see 1,000 people doing an action based upon the amal of 1,000 people, then it overrules a single written hadith. A hadith did not have to be well known or mashhur as required by Imam Abu Hanifa, but no hadith was acceptable if it had been transmitted by a known liar or someone who was a weak memorizer. And Imam Malik actually did not accept many of the reports coming from Ibn Ishaq. And as far as I've studied, he did not accept the report that Aisha radiallahu ta'ala was 6 years old when she was married to the Prophet ﷺ, because it's mentioned that the hadith was narrated by Urwa at an older age when his memory had become weak. This was just one example. What are the principles of Maliki fiqh? Continuing, number 3, customs and practices of the people of Medina at large, because they were the direct descendants of the Sahaba of Medina, based upon a presumption that these people naturally followed the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, since he lived his last 10 years among them, among the people of Medina. And then the ijma, I'm sorry for the spelling mistake here. It's ijma of the Sahaba ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. An individual opinion of a companion radiallahu ta'ala was given a higher regard by Imam Malik than his own opinion. This is a common thread among all the great imams. Then qiyas, then isolated customs and practices of the people of Medina. The first one was the people of Medina at large, which means collective. Here we are talking about the isolated customs and practices. Then istisla, which means public welfare. The concerns and welfare of the general community have to be taken into account when any verdict is given. And then the urf, or the local custom of people throughout the Muslim world, could be recognized as law so long as it does not contradict the Sharia. Now, the Shafi'i madhab was developed by Imam Muhammad Idris al-Shafi'i, who was born in Gaza. He traveled throughout the Islamic world, finding out scholars and learning from them. His quest for knowledge never ended. He, in fact, learned from a sister, a female jurist as well. Her name was Nafisa, and I think she was in the lineage of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And she was alive when Imam Shafi passed away. He studied under Imam Malik, Imam Hassan al-Shabani, and others, including the students of Imam Abu Layth. He was the first to systematize the fundamental principles of jurisprudence. In fact, he is considered to be the grandfather of the Usul al-Fiqh. His most famous work is Ar-Risala, in which he defined the principles of qiyas from the text and established the criteria for their application. It's not that Usul al-Fiqh were not there before him. There were Usul in Imam Malik's fiqh, there were Usuls in Hanafi fiqh, but he formalized them in the form of a text. He was very academic. Shafi'i madhab predominates in Egypt, Indonesia, Kenya, Malaysia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Tanzania, and Yemen. And of course, followers of Shafi'i madhab are to be found in the United States, UK, and other parts of the Western world. What were the principles of Shafi'i madhab? To begin with, the Holy Quran. Nobody can challenge the Holy Quran. Then the Sunnah has to be based upon authentic hadith. He will not put much emphasis on a weak hadith. Imam Shafi'i is credited with having refined the science of hadith criticism. In just to give you one example, this is what is called the tatbiq, that if you have different hadiths on an issue and they seem to have apparent contradiction, how do you resolve that issue? It's called tatbiq. Next one was ijma, where clearly confirmed Imam Shafi'i and ijma is a subject in itself. Individual opinions of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain, and where there was disagreement or variances among them, Imam Shafi'i would choose the opinion closer to the issue being considered. And he was at a level to do that. Not everybody can do that, but he was mujtahid mutlaq. Imam Shafi'i and qiyas. He considered qiyas, or analogical reasoning, to be the farthest legitimate extent of ijtihad, and no decision could be made on any basis beyond any analogy. He rejected the methods of istihsan and istisla used by Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. The Hanbali madhab is based upon the methodology of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He was a student of Imam Shafi'i. He was one of the teachers of Imam Bukhari. You can imagine. He was one of the greatest memorizers and narrators of hadith of his time. His Musnad has over 30,000 ahadith, and it is mentioned that he had more than 600,000 ahadith. He studied under Imam Shafi'i and Imam Abu Yusuf, who was one of Imam Abu Hanifa's leading students. So if you look at these major scholars, the founders of the madhab, they all interacted with each other directly or indirectly through their students. And it is a system of methodology upon which the current Saudi Arabian law is based, at least officially. What were the principles of Hanbali fiqh? Holy Quran, Sunnah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ijma of the Sahaba, but no ijma beyond their era, since it would be impossible to reach a consensus among the scholars who had spread far and wide. So the consensus of the scholars was not necessarily binding according to Imam Ibn Ahmad ibn Hanbal, because how do you confirm that all the scholars everywhere in the Islamic world had accepted a decision which was made by the scholars in a given locality? I think it sounds like a very reasonable approach. Now, individual opinions of all the Sahaba were given consideration, thereby resulting in inconsistent rulings by Hanbali jurists when the Sahaba's opinions differed. So, if you read Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, if you read the Hanbali fiqh, you will find multiple opinions all going to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal on a given issue. For example, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, one opinion is that Fatiha must be recited by the Muqtadi behind the Imam. In another opinion, it must be recited only Surah Al-Fatiha if the Imam was reading it quietly and not when he was reciting it loudly. So, like you have two different opinions. And one way of solving this issue, according to one scholar who probably did his PhD on Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is that these are not necessarily opinions of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Those who came after Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal started to write books of fiqh, and they included all the opinions which they found written in the books of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or which Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is reported to have quoted based upon the individual opinions of Sahaba. And I don't think that we can certainly say what was his own personal opinion. Again, I'm not very knowledgeable in Hanbali fiqh. He preferred weak hadith over qiyas only if the hadith was not clearly fabricated or if a narrator was a liar. He is reported to have said that I, pref- I like to use a weak hadith rather than my own opinion because my opinion is more likely to be incorrect as compared with a hadith which is weak. Qiyas was reluctantly employed as a last resort. He was very reluctant to use his own reasoning, and that's why he preferred weak hadith. And you can imagine that a person who has almost 600,000 hadiths or even more, who put 30,000 hadiths into writing, he would find a hadith for almost any issue if he searched hard enough. Now, the Zahiri madhab, it was established by Dawood Khalaf al-Zahiri. He rejected qiyas altogether and he restricted ijma to the consensus of Sahaba only. He accepted the literal interpretation of the Holy Quran and Hadith, and Fazlur Rahman has mentioned that it freed him from different interpretations because for him, word had a meaning, a specific meaning, and so go with the specific meaning and don't go with peripheral meanings. This madhab had limited success, but it flourished in Spain, particularly under Imam Ibn Hazm. It survived for about 500 years in various forms before being merged with the Hanbali school, and it is said to have been revived in the mid 20th century in parts of the Muslim world. Now, we will also briefly talk about the Fiqh Jafariya. It is named after the sixth Shia Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, who was son of Imam Baqir, who was son of Zainul Abidin, who was son of Hussein radiallahu ta'ala, who was son of Ali radiallahu ta'ala. So we have a lineage here, and it is considered to be the fifth madhab since 1959 by the scholars of the Al Azhar University, and they do teach this madhab as well. In fact, I have a book, Al Fiqh al Madahib al Khamsa. There's a very famous book, Al Fiqh al Madahib al Arba'a, but then there is a book about Al Fiqh al Madahib al Khamsa, which I think the other university teaches, but I have that book. What are the principles of the Jafari fiqh? Again, the Holy Quran. Sunnah of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The range of acceptable hadith called akhbar is restricted to those traditions that were related or narrated by a Shia Imam. They are called akhbari Shia. That they rely upon reports or hadith in their own terminology, so long as they are related to or narrated by a Shia Imam. The ijtihad of the Imam is called the usuli methodology. So the akhbari and usuli. Here, usuli, again, I'm not studying Shia madhab in detail, but just based upon some superficial knowledge, that if they are faced with a new problem which is not to be found in the akhbar have reached them, the Imam of the time will use his own ijtihad. The fiqh is classified as conventional, which is objective, and dynamic, which is subjective. The dynamic fiqh, which means the ongoing process, it takes into account the concept of time, era, and age, zaman wa makan, as well as the concept of place, location, and venue, since these dimensions of thought and reality affect the process of interpreting, understanding, and extracting meaning from the commandments. I'm directly quoting from one of the books on the evolution of fiqh. Now, the last couple of slides are related to an important issue, that why do we have to follow any madhab? We have Bukhari and Muslim. Why don't we just follow the hadith? Okay. Now we have to look at from a different point of view. The early madhab have survived. I've used the word permanence of early madhab. I should have written survival, but I think permanence also conveys my thought process. That despite the criticism of following a madhab, these madhab continue to flourish. Juristic reasoning or ijtihad has not ceased. Not everything is to be found in the books of hadith. And why restrict hadith to two books only? Not every hadith is included by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. In fact, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Imam Bukhari, the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, does not have a hadith about the takbirat of Eid. And Imam Bukhari's Sahih does not have a hadith about zakat on silver. Now, newer issues are still being dealt with through the methodology developed by the founders of the Madhab, with preference given to the Holy Quran, the Sunnah, analogical reasoning, public interest, and consensus, while considering local conditions, customs, and cultures. So the issue comes is why the issue comes, and people would say, we do not follow any Imam, but we follow the Holy Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Well and good. Nobody argues about that to these two divine sources. The answer is, what did the Imams follow? I went through the six mazahib with you, and I gave you their methodology. So just to review their methodology and their preference, the priority of all these madhab, number one is the Holy Quran. Nobody will ever go against the Holy Quran. So if we say that we we don't follow the Imams, we follow the Quran and Sunnah, what did the Imams follow? Did they follow Bible? Did they follow Bhagavad Gita? Did they follow the Majus books? They all went with the Holy Quran first. They were scholars of the Quran as well. It's not that they did not read the Quran or they did not understand the Quran. Next thing, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and even to the extent that they would accept a weak hadith if there was no strong hadith and prefer it over their own individual opinion. They went with the consensus of the companions, radwanullah alayhim. No Imam ever abrogated or gave a verdict against the consensus of the companions. The opinion of the individual companion, radiallahu was also preferred by the Imams over their own opinion. And they said, as I mentioned earlier, that if you find a hadith, reject my fatwa, go with the hadith. My fatwa cannot stand if you find a hadith. And then the consensus of the scholars. So a collective opinion of the scholars of the time is given due importance because they know the time, circumstances, situation of the person, the resources which are available during a particular time. They do take into account the Quran, that they look at the Sunnah of the Prophet. They don't just look at Bukhari and a Muslim only. In fact, I have a book where the scholar from Pakistan has tried to collect all the hadiths according to different issues. There are 5 volumes of that book related to as-salat only. 5 big volumes with thousands of ahadith collected from all the books of ahadith on the topic of salat only. This work is in progress. So you can imagine that. So the point that I want to make is that Islamic fiqh is based upon Quran and the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet. The consensus of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain is given preference to the opinion of any scholar or even consensus of scholars, which obviously is not against the companions of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. The opinions of the individual companions are given preference. And then we have the consensus of the scholars, especially when dealing with contemporary issues which are not to be found in the Holy Quran and the Sunnah. So this was the last talk before the month of Ramadan. Inshallah, I'll be giving daily Ramadan reminders in the evening every day, inshallah. If I made any mistake, then please forgive me and make dua for me. I hope that you benefit from these lectures. And inshallah, after Ramadan, we will start with the lives of the great Imams, starting with the four Imams, Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ash-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And then we will discuss other Aima as well, including the great Muhaddisin, including Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam Tirmizi, Imam Abu Dawud, Imam Ibn Majah, Imam An-Nasai. And before I forget, I just want to mention that Imam Tirmizi has a different style of narrating the hadith. In fact, if you look at the Sahih Sitta, the 6 authentic books of hadith. They are not just two books of Sahih hadith. Other books also contain Sahih hadith. Majority of the hadith in the Sahih Sitta are actually Sahih. Very few are not authentic. Everyone has his own methodology. And Imam At-Tirmidhi, he will have a chapter. Then he will give what he considers to be the most authentic or the strongest narration in that chapter. And then he will say, Wafil Bab an, and there are hadiths in this issue from an, and he will mention the names of the Sahaba without actually quoting those hadiths. So that work is being done to collect all the hadiths related to a particular issue from all the Sahaba. It's a huge work which is ongoing from Pakistan. So I will stop here. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولذكر الله أكبر. الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.